At 8 o'clock this morning, this was a dry riverbed. It's now 10:44 and it is flowing about 2,500 cubic feet per second right now.
The Atten Center is a research and public service project of the state legislature where we focus primarily on water issues in New Mexico and across the Southwest. The Rio Grande is a river that's almost 1,900 miles long. It's utilized by municipalities, by a lot of agriculture, by many indigenous communities. And hopefully the information that's provided in the rest of this video will bring us closer together and incite more cooperation along the river.
The Rio Grande flows from the Colorado-New Mexico border, 470 miles through the state of New Mexico to the Texas-New Mexico border. As the river traverses the entire length of the state of New Mexico, it travels through a variety of ecotomes and geosystems.
From the state line of Colorado down to where we are, the Rio Grande is a very steep gradient river flowing through a basalt gorge created by the breach of a natural dam up in Colorado. That cataclysm caused a lot of erosion and the river is cut to where it is right now. A few miles downstream of here, the river will become a consistently flat gradient stream, but up here where it's very steep gradient, the trout fishing is amazing.
The river flattens out as it flows from Taos through northern New Mexico and eventually to Cochiti Reservoir, which is the beginning of the Middle Rio Grande.
Well, today we're at Cochiti Lake, which is on the Cochiti Pueblo Reservation. And the Rio Grande system where we're sitting at is on the northern edge of the Middle Rio Grande region. Then it goes down south.
So we're standing next to the Rio Grande in the heart of Albuquerque. This is what we call here in New Mexico the Middle Rio Grande, or New Mexico's Middle Rio Grande. The river opens up into this valley that we live in at a place called Cochiti. In the time before humans built dams and levees, this was a free-flowing river. The natural flow of this river would be a big high pulse of water in the summer. With the snowmelt, would flood across the valley floor, gently spread out a mile or more toward the mountains from where we're standing and all the way up against the bluffs that are beyond me here. So what is now the city of Albuquerque?
From the city of Albuquerque, the Rio Grande flows south through the Pueblo of Isleta and into Valencia County.
Here we're about a mile away from the Rio Grande, just to the east of us, which is the Isleta Reach here in Valencia County.
South of Valencia County, the Rio Grande flows through Socorro County, which is rural and full of commercial agriculture. Below the commercial agriculture area within Socorro County is an area colloquially known as the San Marcial Reach, which has little human habitation. The water flows through this area and then continues on to Elephant Butte Reservoir.
This behind me is the main channel of the Rio Grande. We're a couple of miles downstream of Percha Dam. This is the Rio Grande Rift, a major continental geologic feature. This reach of the river I think of as running from Elephant Butte Dam to the north of us, down to a little place called Fort Quitman, Texas, down southeast of El Paso. At times and in places, the river recharges the aquifer. Sometimes the aquifer is discharging into the river. It's almost a transparent boundary between the two.
There are a number of tributaries to the Rio Grande in New Mexico. For our purposes, we're going to be focusing on the Rio Chama and the Pecos River. The Rio Chama makes its headwaters in the San Juan Mountains of southern Colorado, just north of the Colorado-New Mexico border. As the snow melts, the water flows from Colorado over the border into New Mexico. The Rio Chama then flows through New Mexico and joins the Rio Grande as a tributary north of the city of Albuquerque.
I'm standing here in Villanueva State Park, downstream of the headwaters for the Pecos River. The Pecos River, which begins in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of northern New Mexico, flows south through the eastern part of the state and into Texas, where it joins the Rio Grande as a tributary. The upstream portion of the Pecos River flows through Hispanic land-grant communities and Pecos Pueblo. Here in Villanueva State Park, we're near the San Miguel del Bado land grant. South of Santa Rosa, the Pecos River flows into Sumner Lake, which stores water for the Fort Sumner Irrigation District. Downriver of Sumner Lake, the Pecos flows through the Roswell Artesian Basin, an area rich in groundwater. And then it flows into the Carlsbad Valley, where the Carlsbad Irrigation District developed surface water well over a century ago. South of Carlsbad, the Pecos River flows into Texas. Below the state line, the Pecos joins the Rio Grande.
Although people have lived alongside and shepherded the flow of the Rio Grande in New Mexico since time immemorial, the Rio Grande that we see today is a highly managed river that bears little resemblance to the river that people would have seen 500 or 600 years ago, prior to westward expansion. Some of the most dramatic changes to the river occurred only in the past 100 years through the creation of dams, reservoirs, and other diversion structures. These physical changes are directly related to legal frameworks that were created in the early 1900s. These frameworks include reclamation acts and the legal designation of who is entitled to what water, often across state lines, referred to as compacts. The Rio Grande Compact requires Colorado to deliver to New Mexico a certain amount of water based on flows in gauges in Colorado, and then requires New Mexico to deliver to Texas a certain amount of water dependent on gauges in New Mexico. Understanding the ways in which the Rio has been transformed by both physical hands and written words is critically important.
Cochiti Lake was a result of a flood control act that was passed by Congress in the mid-1900s. Initially, Cochiti Pueblo didn't want the lake here, as the Army Corps tried to figure out where best to put a lake along this portion of the Rio Grande system. The lake was established as an earthen-filled dam. It was, at the time, the biggest earthen-filled dam. It's 5 miles long. It is in a location where the hydrology, it's an alluvial flood system. So when the dam was built and the lake was established, the water then pushed downstream of the dam. It pushed the water table up to create wetlands, and it impacted Cochiti, Pueblo, and our people because we couldn't farm in a wetland area. We couldn't grow corn, our melons, and other traditional crops for many years. And so for the Cochiti people and our history, it's a little bit of a sore spot, and we continue to try to figure out how to manage and work with federal officials and state officials on the stewardship of the lake and what to do with the lake in the future.
The two most important things that changed the flow of the river across the 20th century were levees and dams. One of the most important things that we did here in this stretch of the river, beyond building the physical infrastructure, is building the social infrastructure. It was the creation a century ago of the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, what was at that moment a unique government institution in New Mexico that brought together people from a whole bunch of different communities, villages up and down the river, into one sort of cohesive government unit that could undertake the collective action that we needed to manage our relationship with this river. The Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District built those levees. It also did something that we barely notice today, which is dug these long drains alongside the river that lowered the water table in the valley and created a buildable city where we could put farms or subdivisions or businesses at a place that had once been a swamp. The result was a dramatic change in the ecosystem, from a river plain that was wide, that would occasionally have water and water would flow back into the main channel, that had saltgrass marshes and sedges and woody vegetation, to this narrow channel. And in the course of building the narrowed channel, we also created this riparian forest, this riverside bosque that now spans hundreds of miles of river.
The Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District is an offshoot of a long history of irrigation and agriculture in this part of New Mexico. Long before the MRGCD was created, the Puebloan peoples who lived in New Mexico used very similar irrigation structures. When the conquistadores came to New Mexico and saw traditional Pueblo agricultural practices, they implemented their own traditional agricultural practices, commonly called acequias, and tried to introduce European-style agriculture to the land. Under the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, some of these acequias are now called ditches, but they all follow the same set of principles related to water sharing in times of shortage. Although acequia users are not the largest consumers of water in New Mexico, they represent a bridge from historical water management methods dating back to time immemorial, all the way to today's modern irrigation methods.
An acequia is a ditch. That's the technical term. Acequia is a ditch. It's como un canal. But let me give you a different understanding though, cultural understanding. Acequias are like vessels. It moved through the understanding that people had about querencia, a deep understanding of the land, and being able to envision systems, hydrological systems, without having all the machinery and all the technology, no? What runs through the acequia, through this vessel? The way we understand that, the spirit of the water. Because remember, water is alive, and water is going to go in and give life. And so when the water comes in, what is an acequia? An acequia is an instrument that is used to carry the spirit of the water that is going to bless our community so everything can begin and we can have sustenance.
In this reach, we use primarily surface water to irrigate off the Rio Grande through the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District. Once the water hits my land, once I've turned it on, I have about an hour in order to irrigate for the water. So once it gets about 3/4 of the way across my property, I will then turn off the culvert from where it's actually coming from the New Basin in order for it to then convey the rest of the way.
In New Mexico, agricultural infrastructure ranges from very small structures like ditches or acequias, all the way to large-scale federal water storage and management projects.
In the Rio Grande project, which is a reclamation project authorized by Congress in the early 1900s, we've got two big storage dams. We've got Elephant Butte Dam and Caballo Dam. And it is a sole purpose project, one purpose, and that purpose is irrigation. When the farmers down in southern New Mexico and West Texas and in northern Chihuahua want their water, we order it up for release from the reservoirs. The water is allocated based on how much water we've got in storage up in Elephant Butte and Caballo reservoirs and how much of that we can get to the diversion points on the river to EBID El Paso No. 1, which is our sister district in Texas, and then Mexico. The allocation process is conducted by the two irrigation districts, EBID and El Paso No. 1, and the Bureau of Reclamation. Then the Bureau of Reclamation officially sets the allocation based on those discussions.
The Rio Shama contains multiple important reservoirs. Abiquiu Dam, which serves as a flood control and water storage dam for water users in the Middle Rio Grande. El Vado Dam, which is a dam that stores water for irrigators in the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District to use. And Heron Reservoir serves as a collection area for water for the San Juan Chama project, which is a trans-basin diversion project which moves water from the San Juan River in the Colorado River Basin into the Rio Grande Basin through a complex series of tunnels.
New Mexico's Pecos River deliveries are governed by the Pecos River Compact, which has been a subject of significant litigation between the two states over the last decades. In the late 90s, after the Supreme Court found that New Mexico had been under-delivering Pecos River water, the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission purchased junior water rights in the Carlsbad Valley and transferred those rights to the Seven Rivers well field. And there they pump groundwater into the Pecos River to ensure compact compliance. The Carlsbad Irrigation District participated in some of the earliest Bureau of Reclamation water infrastructure projects in the U.S. Water for irrigation in this reach is stored in Avalon and Brantley reservoirs.
Flows in the Rio Grande in New Mexico vary widely, as the Rio Grande is primarily fed by snowmelt and some springs, so there would be periods of very high flow and periods of very low flow. Natural flows, unaltered by dams and other man-made structures, are no longer present on the river due to the number of management structures confining and constraining the Rio Grande that exist these days. Some of these structures are intended to prevent flooding and protect human lives and property, while others of these structures are intended to save water for future use. The net result, though, is that there are no truly natural flows on the Rio Grande anymore. Summer rains, commonly referred to as the monsoon season, don't contribute significantly to the overall flows of the Rio Grande in New Mexico.
The flows fluctuate between 200 cubic feet per second at their lowest, and I've seen flows during snowmelt that are around 3,000 and even higher. Very infrequent. They've been much higher in historical past. When I was a youngster, I remember high flows deep into June. When I was paying attention to those flows, that would have been during the 1980s when the river had lots and lots of snow on an annual basis. It wasn't as hot and dry as it is these days.
Water in the Middle Rio Grande flows off of the Sandia Mountains during periods of intense precipitation, but primarily is supplied by dams upstream of the Middle Rio Grande, including Heron Dam, Elvado Dam, Abiquiu Dam, and Cochiti Dam. Flows in this reach of the Rio Grande range from almost 3,000 cubic feet per second all the way down to 0 cubic feet per second. It's important to remember, however, that aside from very occasional precipitation events that will bring water levels above what water managers in the Middle Rio Grande have prescribed, even the high flows are carefully managed. The water allocated from these dam structures is determined based on a complex set of matrices, including Rio Grande compact allocations, entitlements for the 6 Middle Rio Grande pueblos who have prior and paramount rights to the water in the Middle Rio Grande, and the needs of other water users, including irrigators in the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District and municipalities like the city of Albuquerque. South of the city of Albuquerque, the Rio Grande, in a year with average hydrology and precipitation, will go dry sometime toward the end of irrigation season, somewhere between the Isleta reach of the Rio Grande and San Marcial. This dryness is often persistent or intermittent depending on the precipitation in any given year. This has historically been true of the Rio Grande, which is a desert river that relies heavily on snowmelt and precipitation. However, climate change and increased human use of the river has amplified this problem. The water that flows to irrigators is transported during these low water times in drains along either side of the river. These drains are intended to reduce evaporative losses and ensure that water reaches the water rights holders who rely on it. Around the San Marcial reach, the drains flow into a large ponding area. The Rio Grande then reaches Elephant Butte Reservoir.
So what we did this morning was the first release of the 2025 season from Caballo Reservoir. that will now fill this dry 110 miles of river down to Texas for the first time since August of last year, September of last year. This is a very carefully designed release to push the water down as quickly as possible without creating a whole bunch of flooding or anything like that because we pushed too much, but also not shorting the system and having to trickle it out, which is very inefficient. So what we're trying to do is really punch it down there as quickly and efficiently as possible, but not spilling a drop.
The Rio Grande in New Mexico is home to not only a human population, but a massive non-human population, including plants, animals, insects, and countless creatures too small to see that rely on this river for life.
The Rio Grande in this stretch probably harbors white sucker, Rio Grande sucker, Rio Grande chub, a hybrid between rainbow trout and Rio Grande cutthroat trout. That's a native fish to northern New Mexico. The river also supports brown trout, northern pike. I've seen otters down here. I've seen rattlesnakes, lots of rattlesnakes. I've seen herons. I've seen a lot of waterfowl. Ducks and mergansers like it here. I'm not a big songbird expert, but I've seen a lot of songbirds, bighorn sheep, mule deer. Some petroglyphs upstream from where I'm sitting have drawings of the animals that used to use this river heavily. Grizzly bears, deer, elk. There are elk droppings down here, and it's very remote and difficult to get here. So if I was a wild animal, this is where I would live.
The river is not only the lifeblood to us, but it's also the lifeblood to the ecosystem, the riparian area. The ecosystem and the living beings are essential to the sustainability, the resiliency, and all the blessings that are uniquely dependent on that Rio Grande River flow.
We do have multiple species in the river, including endangered species that include the silvery minnow. We also do have an endangered plant, which is the Pecos sunflower. Further south, lower reach Bosque del Apache, the jumping mouse.
There are some endangered or otherwise sensitive species. The big one is the southwestern willow flycatcher, and we do have several nesting habitats up and down the New Mexico portion of the river here, and the yellow-billed cuckoo is generating some interest too. We do not have Rio Grande silvery minnows here. They were basically extirpated from this reach back in the drought of the 50s.
The Rio Chama is designated as a wild and scenic river for a nearly 25-mile stretch. This stretch includes herds of elk, deer, a variety of migratory birds, and a myriad of native plant species that call this stretch of the river home.
From the headwaters to the community of Torero, the Pecos is designated as a wild and scenic river. This reach of the river provides habitat for many species, including the threatened Mexican spotted owl and the endangered northern goshawk, and also is known for incredible biodiversity and a number of endemic species. That means they're only found on the Pecos River. Those include the Pecos sunflower, Pecos gambusia, which is a fish, Pecos blunt-nosed shiner, Pecos springnail, and also the Texas hornshell mussel.
For people living across the state of New Mexico, the Rio Grande means many things. For some, it is a source of livelihood. For others, it is a place of recreation. And for many, it is a place to come home to.
The river here in the gorge is a really popular fishing spot. There are great insect populations, a lot of trout food, beautiful trout. Another recreation use is world-class rafting on a hot day, which they come frequently in this gorge. People like just come and soak in the river. Below here, once the river comes out of the canyon, the river's also used for agriculture. Seeing some corn, a lot of orchards, alfalfa fields. These days, with high alfalfa prices in the dairy industry and the cattle industry, I think that's a crop that a lot of people just go to automatically. A lot of those villages also have cattle that they graze in the mountains, and that feed they grow during the summer sustains their herd over the winter.
The Rio Grande River means a lot to our Pueblo people, especially along the Middle Rio Grande region. Since time immemorial, we've depended upon the water delivery, the surface water delivery for irrigation purposes. In less than 100 years ago, we still relied on the Rio Grande River for our drinking water, cooking water, as well as our household water. When today, it's mostly relied upon for irrigation, but also we rely on the Rio Grande River for cultural and traditional purposes as well throughout the entire year. So as of today, 2025, the Middle Rio Grande Pueblos continued their irrigatable practices and agricultural practices, and a lot of the water that they utilize is prior and paramount water. That is, the Pueblo people have been here since time immemorial and utilize the water for irrigation purposes. And so in today's water context, they have the right as first in line to use the water for that particular type of consumptive use of the water.
It's important to step back in time and think about the communities that have been here before Spanish colonization, before this became part of the United States, to the Pueblo communities that have lived on this valley floor for time immemorial, centuries and centuries and centuries of time. These are communities that lived in high spots near the river, and as the river would rise up and flood, they would be safely above the floodplain, and they would farm on the valley floor where rich soil built up from the annual flooding cycle. That cycle is no more. That was a very difficult river to live with when we wanted to build a city here on the floor of the Rio Grande Valley. So we began changing the river.
People in the metropolitan area of Albuquerque rely on the Rio Grande for drinking water, sanitation, hobby farming, and some small-scale commercial agricultural operations, as well as a community gathering place and a source for ceremony. The Rio Grande, which in turn supports the Bosque, one of the largest state parks in New Mexico, also creates space for recreationalists to enjoy hiking, cycling, fishing, and gathering along the river.
What we call today the South Valley used to be the Valley of Tehuex, which is part of the Tehuantepec tradition. In the old testimonies of the people who lived here in the 1900s, there's still the stories about everybody getting up in the morning and singing a blessing song to bless the day. There was a different type of life that was still connected to the spirit of the water, the spirit of the wind, the spirit of the fire. All these things that today we don't have. In terms of traditional acequia culture, when I say traditional, now I'm moving to North Africa and the Muslim tradition that created this. And our cultural ways, from the acequias all the way to the Mexican tradition of cultivating, is a spiritual connection that we're not willing to let go.
In this reach, primarily we grow hay here. We don't have a lot of row crops. We do have some smaller produce farmers as well as folks that do value-added products. A lot of them are like me, where we have pasture for the fact that the water isn't as stable. We have 3 acres here on the property. I am raising livestock for milk as well as the pigs for meat. And so I usually schedule water about 21 to 25 days. I've gone as long as 49 days between irrigations just when there's less water. And I'm able to do that because I raise my livestock on permanent pasture. I actually don't cut my pastures for hay. I just graze and do a strict rotational grazing schedule.
We certainly do have some hobby farmers, but a big acreage is definitely commercial agriculture. The agricultural system in the Elephant Butte Irrigation District is authorized to serve 90,640 acres. They actually serve something like 72,000 acres because what farmers have done is they've taken the surface water that they do have and concentrated it on less acreage. And they do that for a couple of reasons. For one thing, they have less water, but also they've gone to growing higher crops than they did, say, in the drought of the 50s. It was 80%, 90% cotton. Now you've got the biggest crop is pecans, which take a whole lot more water. There's a lot of alfalfa, cotton, and then you get into a lot of the higher value specialty crops, things like chili, onions, cabbage, lettuce, the vegetable crops, and then there's small grains and things that fill it out or for a partial season. There has been some conversion of water from irrigation to municipal industrial. That started with El Paso back in the 1940s, and I would expect to see that happening in the New Mexico portion in the near future. The municipalities, mutual domestics, and the public water supply systems, they use groundwater largely that is connected, hydrologically connected to the river. So, if they're to continue using more and more water all the time, I'm going to pull more and more water from the river.
The San Juan Shama project is critically important for delivering water to municipal water users in the city of Albuquerque, the city of Santa Fe, and the city of Los Alamos. This water is important for irrigators in the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, especially when there's insufficient water in the Rio Grande system to supply water to all of these users. Additionally, the Rio Shama is a popular place for recreation, fishing, and also an important cultural place for the people of New Mexico.
The Pecos, like all New Mexico rivers, is beloved. It's loved in the headwaters, up in the Pecos Wilderness where I first met it, and it's loved in communities like Villanueva and others along its banks, where people fish and farm and ranch.
Today, the Rio Grande Basin in New Mexico faces many challenges. Continued aridification and forecasts that indicate a 25% reduction in runoff in the next 50 years pose serious challenges to getting water to people and ecosystems that need it. Additionally, the Rio Grande Compact and the Pecos River Compact continue to dictate flows and continue to need modifications in the form of settlements to accommodate the river as it is today. Currently, Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, and the federal government are all engaged in settlement talks, which will hopefully prevent future litigation from arising. Ultimately, all water managers along the Rio Grande Basin in New Mexico will have to find new solutions to manage water for the human and non-human communities that rely on the Rio Grande.
I'm not sure what climate change is going to do to this river and its trout fishery or its wildlife. The trout fishery is important to sustaining fish, which feed otters and sustain a lot of recreation for small towns and people along the river. I'm not sure what climate change is going to do to that, but we're really leaning hard on a lot of riverside springs in the Rio Grande Gorge to sustain a trout-friendly temperature. Trout need cold water, and there are a lot of springs in the Rio Grande Gorge up to the state line that really keep the river cool during the summer. And if the hydrology or other conditions in this canyon were to change too much to my detriment, it would be a sad thing.
We've been in this place that we call Cochiti here today Since time immemorial, Pueblo people, we've learned to be sustainable, we've learned resiliency, even in the past of other drought systems. So today, as we continue to figure out how not only our Pueblo manages and stewards the resources for today in the drought that we are here in 2025, but also how we can utilize the expertise and knowledge, then we can help work and collaborate with state and federal entities in order to develop good strategies for water management, water stewardship, because in my perspective, I should say, the river is essential to our way of life as Pueblo people, not just for irrigation purposes, but for those traditional and cultural purposes. And so we like to bridge that gap and intersect our knowledge and expertise, and really encouraging tribal leadership to have that seat at the table so that that can be shared with state and federal officials.
So we have big challenges going forward in managing our relationship with this river. The first and most important one is there is less water. We're seeing less flows in the Rio Grande than we used to see. We expect over the next 50 years an additional 25% reduction or more in the flow in the Rio Grande. So figuring out as communities how we come together to share a shrinking water supply when we have competing and conflicting values, people who want to see water in the river itself for its natural beauty and environmental benefit, people who want to see green spaces in the community beyond. These are the really critical challenges we face. We also face that challenge at a time when all the infrastructure that we built over the last century is aging. Some of it is breaking down completely. El Vado Dam is currently under repair and not terribly usable. Up north of us here, upstream, the Corrales siphon, which brings irrigation water under the river to the village of Corrales and irrigators on the west side of the river, has failed. We need to replace it. We need to come up with millions of dollars to do that. So at the same time we have less water and more challenges, we also have this layer of financial challenge on top of it. Managing this river over time is going to take the collective action and the collective will of a broad community of local and state and federal government. But it poses a significant challenge because we do have a legal but also a moral obligation to get some of this water on down to the neighbors to the south of us with whom we share this river. And that, going forward, as climate change reduces the flow in the river, becomes one of our greatest challenges.
As a result of climate change, the threat number one is the lack of water. The other threat is the lack of understanding about the history and the connections to the legal aspects of acequias, right? And what that actually means for people's assets. In 1935, when the MRGDC came and signed contracts with every acequia to maintain the system and to distribute the water, there were a lot of aspects that affected these communities, from a new economy, the war that was taking place, and people having to go to work out to make money to pay newly taxes, because this was not a cash economy. The acequia culture slowly has been fading away from the memory of the people of those communities since the 1930s. Part of the problem that we have had is that all these things, water, food, are like gifts from the Creator. And so the very question to us from an ethical point of view is, what are we actually doing with the gifts that Creator or God gave us, right? And I will say that if we are honest to ourselves, we are mismanaging.
Farmers facing water shortages due to climate change and like the new climate reality that we live in now. There's less water availability, there's uncertainty in water. And so you see different types of crops that we're also planting, things that can withstand longer times. You're seeing necessarily less grass, more alfalfa, different varieties of alfalfa, as well as different, short season grasses or cool season grasses and grains, as well as making sure that our water delivery system is also becoming more efficient. We also see fallowing happening, right, where you can actually fallow your field for a year, maybe 2 years, invest that into conservation of water on your farm. Maybe you want to rest your soils for a little bit, rest your land. Maybe you want to reinvest in a better seed for the climate that we live in now. You know, a lot of farmers say, well, we're the endangered species, but we can make good choices, I think, and work together, all of us. I think that we can all sacrifice a little bit.
We find that with the warming climate, we're getting far less than average runoff. Well, this whole project was conceived in the late 1800s, early 1900s, based on that snowmelt runoff. That's the bread and butter of the Rio Grande project. Yet, we see that in years where we're getting average snowpack, we're getting maybe 25% of average runoff. And in years like this snow season just concluding now, we have a terrible snowpack and basically no spring runoff. That's why we're standing here almost in June, releasing water for the first time in the season. What we would consider normal in prior years would be beginning of March. But the fact that we've got so little water in storage, no water coming down from our spring runoff, which should run through July. We're having to run what little surface water we have sort of fast and furious to get through the hot part of the season, then we'll shut off. Before and after we have the surface water in the system, farmers are relying on groundwater. Well, that groundwater, basically the sole source of recharge of the groundwater is the river and irrigation system. And if they don't have water in them, you're reducing the recharge. At the same time, people don't have surface water, so they turn on their wells and pump groundwater. So the groundwater is getting less recharge, greater withdrawals. It's a double whammy, as we technically say, on the aquifer system. And we can see very precipitous drops in aquifer storage in drought years like this. The difference between the management and the hydrology is pretty stark. The surface water is Rio Grande project, and EBID basically manages the New Mexico portion of the Rio Grande project from here down to El Paso. Then El Paso operates the rest of the way down. And the two really don't coordinate too much. And I think this disconnect between the management and the hydrology is how we wind up, for example, in Texas versus New Mexico.
In 2024, after an unexpected heavy precipitation event, a significant amount of sediment was flushed into the main stem of the Rio Chama south of Abiquiu Dam. This sediment caused a significant amount of flooding as it displaced water that normally travels along the main channel of the river and moved that water into the irrigated agricultural land alongside the river and in many cases into people's homes. It took almost an entire year and a series of remediation projects done in collaboration with the Army Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, and the Albuquerque-Bernalillo County Water Utility Authority, all working in conjunction to remove the sediment and ultimately free up the main channel of the river. Precipitation events such as the one that caused the Rio Chama sediment plug, as it is now referred to, will likely become more common as climate change and climate variability increases. Consequences from climate change, such as the Rio Chama sediment plug, can complicate water deliveries and create further challenges in meeting Rio Grande compact obligations. But every obligation is an opportunity in disguise.
Like all watersheds in New Mexico, the Pecos River must contend with reduced snowpack and earlier runoff. Reduced runoff, in turn, can lead to lower flows in the river. Less water in the system overall will likely impact groundwater and water management, since groundwater and surface water are managed conjunctively in New Mexico, which means that the state recognizes that they're connected, and you can think about rivers as groundwater being daylighted. In a drying climate, there may be an increased demand on already reduced flows in the Pecos River, as well as increased challenges in meeting the Pecos River compact. South of the community of Torero, the proposed Torero mine could pose risks to the health of the Pecos watershed.
Our current hydrologic and climate realities mean that in many ways stationarity, that is, our ability to use previous models to predict the future, no longer exists. As we think about a future we can't comprehend, people across the Rio Grande Basin in New Mexico are contemplating their goals and values for the future of our shared river.
I've been a fishing guide and a fly fisherman pretty much my whole life. I grew up in New Mexico. I love New Mexico. I love this river. It's spectacular. But because I've been a fishing guide, I've been fortunate enough to fish all over the world for trout. Nevertheless, this river right here is probably my top 5 best favorite river in the world. I hope this section of the Rio Grande can maintain flows either through spring flows or through water arrangements made between the parties to the Rio Grande Compact, where each state gets a share of water that is not only what the humans require to sustain life, but also that the natural world gets its share as well. Especially in New Mexico, such a huge part of our economy relies on visitation from out of state. And the Rio Grande carries a super huge share of that load. And then we have a cultural makeup in New Mexico that also leans pretty hard on this river.
Oh, this river is so special to me. I've grown up along the Middle Rio Grande River. I'm from Cochiti all the way down south to San Felipe. The ecosystem, the holistic perspective of what the river means to me and our people, to my kids, teaching that to my kids as well. It is an essential piece of who I am, and it's been, I would say, a foundational piece for me in what I do, in my heart, as I continue to try to work with everybody, with the entire state, with the feds, with other pueblos, with our community, to ensure the stewardship and the sustainability and the respect of the river. It's a lifeblood for this Middle Rio Grande region. As my grandma from San Felipe says, it was her hope that the river would always flow, that the riparian area would be there. All the traditional and cultural uses and purposes of the river would continue to flow. All of the dynamics that happen in this stretch of the river, the eddies that happen, the hydraulic jumps, the hydraulic falls, all of the riparian area, the cottonwoods, the animals, the vegetation, to be thriving and resilient and sustainable for this portion of the river. And at some point, the dam has a life. It was constructed with a 100-year life. So at some point in the future, will there be a dam? I don't know. But we need to continue to plan and look ahead so that this river at some point can flow like it did 100 years ago.
The priorities that we have today versus the priorities that our kids will have in the future. And we have to be sincere to ourselves and say, are we leaving something for them to have? My hope for the future is that we will do a good job in planting seeds. We're working with the schools. We want to plant seeds upon understanding the cycles of the earth. Acequia Limpias, where we bring out students, families, we're reviving a way of living that is attached to the understanding of acequias. So why makes it this special? Because here we have an opportunity to bring all those feelings back. Acequias are communal. So we hope that 30 years from now, there will be more young people who have great understanding about those things.
I love this part of the river. I think it really brings the community together. I hope that we can continue having a river that's sustainable in itself, sustainable for the farmers that rely on it, the species that use it, as well as the individuals who just enjoy the river for the river itself. I see the value of farming, not just of what the farm can give to me through the food that it provides, but also ensuring that I can be a caretaker of the land, and that's something that was instilled in me as a very young kid. I don't see myself as like, this is my land, but I am the steward of this land, and I am the caretaker of this land, and if I take care of this land, it will take care of me in return. Same thing with the animals. Good animal husbandry is really important, and making sure that my animals are healthy, well taken care of. And I just find that the more that you put into the land and your farm and your animals and livestock, the more that they give back to you.
For most of the time I lived in Las Cruces, I lived right on the river, and my kids grew up playing in it. So it's very much a part of my career, my interest, but also my family. I hope that people can be realistic and lower their expectations with the available water supply. It's a different river at this point. So I'm hoping that people can be responsible stewards of the water, understand that this is real. It's not a bunch of hysterical academics, it's reality. I've watched it happen for 30 years, the decline in the water supply here. And I hope that what they can do is adapt the culture. You know, New Mexican culture has always adapted. I hope we can adapt to it intelligently and do it through identifying our common values and adjusting our use of water to fit the supply consistent with those shared values. I hope that we can rethink the way that we govern water in the state, because what we have now is governance paradigm that is based on plentiful water and trying to encourage expanded use of it for economic generation. That's not the situation we're in now. We're in a declining supply, and we need to recognize that and manage it appropriately. The ecosystem of the river, it's going to adapt the way nature does things, and that can be pretty stark and unpleasant, but it's going to happen, and that's another area where I hope we can be intelligent about it. I see we're going to have to design mechanisms into our physical and institutional infrastructure to better be able to maintain some semblance of habitat for as long as possible.
We have the opportunity to share with one another what we value and love about this river and figure out how to manage it with less water now and into the future.